And thank you, Professor Nepi. I'll be diverging completely from what Professor Nepi discussed. While he focuses on moral philosophy, my area is metaphysics, and the Canticle of the Creatures aligns more closely with my interests. Metaphysics often evokes a sense of awe, and I hope you'll find the interpretation of Friar Sun's song engaging. I refer to the critical edition text within the context of the thought of a relatively unknown Italian philosopher, Teodorico Moretti-Costanzi. Because Moretti-Costanzi is not widely known, I had initially prepared a report starting with a brief biography to introduce his philosophical system before delving into the main discussion. However, Professor Nepi's presence here today has prompted me, for which I thank him, to synthesize my presentation, a valuable skill for us philosophers. I decided to start with the core of Moretti-Costanzi's interpretation of the canticle, and then, if time permits, provide some context about his system. So I've reorganized my PowerPoint accordingly. Let's see if the slides are working. Thank you. First, regarding Moretti-Costanzi's life, there isn't much to say. He was born, lived, and died around Lake Trasimeno, and his double surname indicates his Umbrian nobility. He was deeply rooted in Umbrian culture. To understand his acceptance of the spirituality and thought of St. Francis of Assisi within his philosophical system, it's important to note his connection to the world of St. Francis. Interestingly, he was baptized in the same baptistery as Margherita da Cortona. And when that church went down, he brought the baptistery to his house and kept it in his house, this baptistery relic, because the church had gone up in ruin, and in this sense to be tied also to a tradition of saints of his land. Here is an image to illustrate my point. In this modern representation, you can see Teodorico Moretti-Costanzi and the dates of his life. He was born in Pozzuolo Umbro and died near Lake Trasimeno, where he had repurchased a family villa he called the Palace, from which he signed all his works. The key fact about his life is that he spent about 30 years as a professor of theoretical philosophy, equivalent to the chair of metaphysics at the Pontifical Universities, at the University of Bologna, which has a distinct Bonaventurian tradition. One of his last disciples, Professor Maurizio Malaguti from Bologna, fits him into a specific philosophical genealogy. This is one of the latest editions of his works. It doesn't contain all his plays, but includes some of the most important ones, which I will reference tonight. I'll also show you where the others can be found. Here, I've outlined his three most significant works. They form a trilogy: The Pure Philosophy, 1959, Ethics in its Necessary Conditions, 1965, and The Pious Aesthetics, 1966. The tripartite structure echoes the three Kantian questions. What can we know? Pure philosophy. What should we do? And what can we hope for? Aesthetic and theological judgment in pious aesthetics. This structure is very important. These are considered his major works and form his philosophical system although Moretti-Costanzi himself might not have accepted the term system, and we will explore why. This work is undoubtedly his masterpiece. I decided to dive right into the most challenging aspects rather than taking the easier route of analyzing Moretti-Costanzi's studies on Bonaventure or St. Francis, as the Canticle of the Creatures would have been too straightforward. I focus I focused on his more theoretical works, especially the central one. Here are a few crucial quotes from the Canticle that I will briefly interpret before connecting them to concepts from his other works. This isn't a comprehensive analysis, but rather selected highlights. What is pure philosophy? Moretti Costanzi uses it almost as a heuristic tool to initiate our inquiry. As he says, common philosophy presents itself as a human inquiry into reality. In contrast, pure philosophy, as discussed in the work from which we draw our first quote, is the direct voice of reality, with a capital R. This indicates his ontological approach, where the fundamental entity or principle is grasped almost directly by consciousness. This is pure philosophy, not merely epistemic, but an aspiration for truth, which can also be found in art, religion, and other testimonies. Moretti Costanzi's ontologism owes a significant debt to Pantaleo Caraballese, who invited him to teach at the University of La Sapienza in Rome. He started with aesthetics and later delved into theoretical philosophy under Caraballese, who advocated a critical, non-religious ontologism. We can distinguish between epistemic philosophy and what I've termed extra-philosophical philosophy, which aspires to wisdom beyond the traditional scope and methods of philosophy reminiscent of the ancient pre-Socratics. In medieval scholastic tradition, there were two ways of approaching knowledge: sermo scientia, the discourse of science, and sermo sapientia, the discourse of wisdom. Bonaventura particularly emphasizes this distinction, and it's crucial to understanding Moretti Costanzi's philosophical approach. We will explore this further in the context of Moretti Costanzi's interpretation of the Canticle and his broader philosophical system. Now let's turn to the first and most important quote from Moretti Costanzi's Pure Philosophy, found in chapter 4, section D. This chapter addresses the truth of philosophy and its criticism, with section D focusing on the perennial discovery of pure philosophy as an insight into the consciousness of self, the world, and God. Moretti Costanzi explains, the Christian mystical philosophers who use the verb to see more clearly did not fail to elevate the other senses to that level, making them all a unified, rich experience, equally bearing witness to the presence of God. Furthermore, the present God, whose presence was affirmed by St. Anselm and confirmed by Alexander of Hales and Bonaventura, was the God of the Canticle of the Creatures, achieved by the world because it attained the total soul. This passage, with its dense and intricate style, requires some unpacking. Moretti Costanzi discussed the Christian mystics and their preference for the verb to see, contrasting this with the philosophy of Plotinus, whom he discussed earlier. Plotinus, a significant influence on Moretti-Costanzi, is noted for his emphasis on vision as the primary mode of metaphysical sight, a view that traces back to Aristoteles and finds resonance in Sir Thomas Aquinas. However, Moretti-Costanzi suggests that for Bonaventura, the sense of touch is more significant than sight. This aligns with the Franciscan experience of being immersed in the world, contrasting with the more detached contemplation of vision. Christian mystics, he argues, expanded this contemplative seeing to include all the senses, transforming it into a tasty experience that engages the whole person. This sensory richness is reminiscent of the term wisdom, derived from sapere, meaning to taste. For those familiar with St. Francis's writing, the word see in his first admonition is pivotal, signifying the contemplation of the sacrament as a symbol connecting the believer to God. In the Eucharist, Francis's vision is not merely visual, but a full immersion in the mystery. This interpretation aligns with the studies of Father Cesare Vaiani on the role of seeing in St. Francis's first admonition. Unfortunately, Moretti-Costanzi only had access to the Canticle of the Creatures for his analysis. On this notion of tasty experience, Bonaventura defines wisdom as experimental knowledge of God, a concept further developed by Jean Gorson and foundational in the study of mysticism. For Moretti-Costanzi, this experiential knowledge fully embraces the individual from within. In this context, the term consciousness is crucial for Moretti-Costanzi. It signifies where one is present and how one embraces the world in a particular way. This emphasis on consciousness reflects Moretti-Costanzi's indebtedness to Bonaventura, which recurs throughout his works. Here is a refined version of your text. Witnesses of the present God. The term present God is briefly referred to here as the maximum, using Moretti-Costanzi's own italics. This refers to Saint Anselm's concept of God as the greatest being conceivable, beyond which nothing greater can be thought. This idea of God as the maximum is seen and confirmed by Alexander of Hales and Bonaventura, particularly in the context of the Canticle of the Creatures. There is an emphasis on surpassing the contemplation of the maximum from Saint Anselm to the more experiential understanding in the Canticle of the Creatures. Before continuing, I need to highlight the significance of the whole soul in this context. Anselm's argument plays a crucial role in the Franciscan school. Tomatis, in his work, states that Anselm's argument has been influential in philosophical reflection from Descartes to Hegel, forming the basis of their speculative systems. However, theology, with the exception of the Franciscan school that reinterpreted Augustine through Anselm, like Alexander of Hales, Bonaventura, Duns Scotus, and some modern theologians, such as Barth, largely followed Thomas Aquinas in rejecting this demonstration. This insight from Tomatis helps us understand Anselm's argument's role within the Franciscan tradition, which Moretti-Costanzi acknowledges when he says it was detected and confirmed by Alexander of Hales and Bonaventura, key figures in the Parisian line of the Franciscan school. Now, I want to highlight the authors and philosophers to whom Moretti-Costanzi dedicated one or more monographs. These include Schopenhauer, Spinoza, with a focus on the problem of God, Novalis, Plato, Heidegger, and of course Anselmi. Moretti-Costanzi also wrote extensively on Nietzsche, especially Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and its titular character. In fact, Moretti-Costanzi offers a positive interpretation of Nietzsche, suggesting that the Superman is akin to Saint Francis of Assisi, someone who transcends the Apollonian for the Dionysian. Moretti-Costanzi was greatly influenced by Nietzsche's work, as well as Plotinus, whom I mentioned earlier. He devoted several works to Bonaventura and in recent years identified his entire system with Bonaventurian doctrine. Augustine is another major influence in his later studies. However, Moretti-Costanzi was less fond of Thomas Aquinas, particularly regarding conceptual arguments. There are some of the lesser-known authors to whom Moretti-Costanzi dedicated monographs. Michael Stadler, emphasizing the primacy of ethics, Fouillet discussing conscience, and Bernardino Varisco and Pantaleo Carabellese, the latter being almost directly his teacher, as well as Carmelo Ottaviano. Bernardino Varisco and Carabellese are particularly significant as they represent the 19th century tradition of ontology, each embodying different types of ontologism, which influenced Moretti-Costanzi's own ontological perspective. Now, regarding the concept of tota soul, what does it mean? This term reflects the dual sense in which the Canticle of the Creature helps us understand what Teodorico Moretti-Costanzi means by pure philosophy. It suggests a world comprehended in its entirety by the totality of the soul. Tota sometimes carries a dual significance. It encompasses both the subject and the object, though these terms shouldn't strictly apply to Moretti-Costanzi's system. Tota indicates the fullness of consciousness as well as the completeness of what consciousness embraces. Earlier, we mentioned the world, the self, and God, these three. There is an echo of what Plato called totality, where he said, "Whoever sees the whole is a philosopher. Who doesn't, no." Plato implied that the whole comprises both the world and God. That is what tota signifies. Tota, soul, indicates the comprehensive embrace. Now let's move to the interpretation of the canticle. Saint Francis of Assisi presents us with a superior argument to that of Saint Anselm. The canticle primarily reflects the consciousness of Francis, who is fully present in it. And in this totality, he embraces himself, God, and all creatures simultaneously. This fully respects the whole consciousness of being, which Moretti-Costanzi terms pure philosophy. Furthermore, Moretti-Costanzi highlighted another merit of the Canticle of the Creatures in 1992 in the interview with Jesus. Beauty is worth more than metaphysics. In this comprehensive consciousness, there is an experience of truth that surpasses what metaphysics achieves through Aristotelian concepts. It is an immediate presence. Another quote from Moretti-Costanzi states, "This theologically mature consciousness knew as never before that the principle of the whole cannot be revealed except in the consecration of the whole self, and that from this totality, which inherently demands all feeling, the world is required in equal order." This reflects a profound understanding that integrates God, the world, and the self in a unified consciousness, illustrating Moretti-Costanzi's vision of pure philosophy. Here, the song of the creatures. The world is present in its entirety, encompassing everything. This reflects the principle that Moretti-Costanzi finds in the Canticle of the Creature, which he regards as the best version of Anselm's argument. In this essence, which involves existence, Moretti-Costanzi sees the present reality of the world. I'll now mention another piece, briefly, highlighting a few passages. This is not found in Bompiani's book. It's from his course on theoretical philosophy, comprising two courses, from being to existence and from existence to being. They were among the most important courses he taught at the University of Bologna after attaining his chair in theoretical philosophy, predating the elaboration of pure philosophy. Notice the title. It emphasizes reaching being from existence and the understanding that existence also stems from being. This reverses the Platonic structure of moving from being to existence and then returning to being. This Platonic structure, known as exitus reditus, is well explained by Walter Bayer. Moretti-Costanzi concludes his final theoretical lesson on transitioning from being to existence through the knowledge of pure philosophy with these words. You implement this reason, and with it, you realize a nature that makes us speak not of reality, but of what lies below reality. Then metaphysics will be fulfilled by being eliminated. In other words, establish the Franciscan verb as the logo, that is the being of the world of St. Francis, and this alone will be the true ontology. This term is dense with meaning. The existence described in the Canticle of the Creatures in pure philosophy is the world of St. Francis, embraced with all the soul and consciousness. It simultaneously encompasses the being of the principle and the existence of the contingent, all in one. This is true ontology. There is a passage that illustrates the misunderstandings surrounding Moretti-Costanzi's philosophy within the Church. The metaphysics developed from the Aristotelian episteme, as Professor Nepi reminded us, and supported by Enrico Berti, ultimately reaches the transcendent. However, this metaphysics is realized by its elimination, moving beyond conceptual procedures to the full presence of being in consciousness. This involves recognizing the being of existence and the existence of being, transcending mere conceptual representation. With this, he concludes with the good of being in the world of St. Francis, an explicit reference to the canticle in his lectures on theoretical philosophy. Another quote I take from the Philosophical Revelation, the last work I'll mention, illustrates this further. I focused only on this, or we would get lost, but it is clear that St. Francis plays a central role in Moretti-Costanzi's philosophy. In this 1982 work, as we approach the end of the last century, he examines the praise of the creator of the stars in St. Augustine and Plotinus. He brings in the song of Brother Sun to highlight a significant contrast. Notice how he observes what is missing from Augustine's stars. They are ordered and harmonized, but lack the personal creative contemplation seen in St. Francis's canticle, where the stars are described as uniquely precious and beautiful. St. Francis, in the song, embraces the contingent and is in he himself embraced. The immensity and infinity of God, manifest in the starry sky, are not distant, but intimately and joyfully present, with each star individually cherished. This perspective is typical of Franciscan thought, emphasizing the individuality and beauty of each creation. Disciples of Moretti-Costanzi have studied the conceptions of Augustine and Bonaventura regarding the role of anguish. Bonaventura lacks this anguish due to St. Francis' mediating influence, while Augustine's views still retain some Manichaean and overly Platonic elements. In contrast, Moretti-Costanzi sees an overcoming of the anguish through the embrace of the being of the body and the bodies. Moretti-Costanzi also provides a biography of St. Francis, focusing on the search for beauty in his surroundings. This is not a hagiographic biography, but a philosophical one, a philography of St. Francis. The Canticle of the Creatures is not proposed by chance. The nature it celebrates, effectively evoked by the word adherent, bears the mark of a profound experience in reality and quality. Here, the definition of wisdom emerges again as experience, this consciousness that encompasses totality, meaning God, the contingent, the self, the world, and God. This profound experience transcends any concept of form of reasoning. Let's start with a theoretical example to illustrate this and then conclude. Tracing the history of ontology from Parmenides' statement, where thinking and being are the same, as Gadamer explained, shows that thought is not discursive but intuitive, akin to the sensory experience. This concept brings us back to the five senses, including taste and smell, as if Parmenides' thought were as immediate as nosebleed and intuition. In the history of ontology, we eventually reach idealism, to which Moretti-Costanzi, like the teacher Pantaleo Carabellese, must refer. During this time in Italy, idealism, particularly under Giovanni Gentile, dominated. Here we see two possibilities, Schelling and Giovanni Gentile. While Giovanni Gentile does influence Moretti-Costanzi, I focus on Schelling, specifically the late Schelling, whose last lectures, collected and published by his sons, appear as the philosophy of mythology or exposition of purely rational philosophy. This purely rational philosophy of Schelling is distinct from Kant's notion of the pure. Asserting the essence of principle is achieved inductively, not deductively. From this unity of being thought or thoughts of being, as Moretti Costanzi titled one of his first works in 1939, Thoughts and Being, arise two ways of viewing metaphysics. One, referenced by Professor Nepi and Enrico Berti, is introduced by Bontadini as the unity of experience, posting that the unity of being and thinking overcomes Kantian criticism. This unity of experience becomes the starting point of metaphysics, as Father Marshall suggests. For Teodorico Moretti, however, this unity is given in philosophy within the moment of consciousness, marking the end and purpose of metaphysics. Metaphysics reaches its goal by accepting this total presence in consciousness, which he calls philosophy. Returning to Franciscan thought and the Canticle of the Creatures, we could summarize in the words of Bonaventura, Deus summe nobilis, God's supremely knowable. Because in the Canticle of Brother Sun, God is foremost summe sensitis et summa pulchritudo, supremely sensible and supremely beautiful. These terms, of course, constitute the exegesis of Moretti-Costanzi himself. Thank you, and I apologize if I took a bit more time than anticipated. Thank you very much.